very honored to have Professor Louis DeSipio speak to us tonight. May you live in interesting times. He will speak about the era of increasing white resentment of minority electoral empowerment. Professor DeSipio is professor of political science and Chicano Latino studies at USI and is also director of the Jack Pelterson Center for the Study of Democracy. He is frequently interviewed on TV and radio, and we'll soon see why. A prolific writer, Professor DeSipio is the author of Counting on the Latino Vote, Latinos as a New Electorate. He has co-authored several other books and is the author of recent articles on immigration. Excuse me? He is also the author and editor of an 8-volume series on Latino political values, attitudes, and behaviors. Professor DeSipio is past president of the Western Political Science Association. Please welcome Professor Louis DeSipio and stay for the Q&A to follow. Professor DeSipio.
Well, thank you very much for a generous introduction and some UCI support, and we don't get that very often, so it's good to hear. I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a big election coming up in a week and think about some of the ongoing patterns in American politics that I think are relevant, not just to this election, but really looking forward. And, you know, I'm seizing the old Chinese proverb that you should live in interesting times, and these are clearly interesting times. Oh, sure. We're working this out. So anyway, just to remind you of this election, I mean, it's gone by so rapidly we might have forgotten, but there's been a lot that has been a little unusual. We had 17 Republican candidates at one point, including, I should note, an African American, a couple of Latinos, an Asian American, and a woman, not traditional for the Republicans. We've had the first woman nominated by a major political party, something that's been lost, I think, in a lot of the discourse because of, well, Mr. Trump, who has tended to absorb most of the airtime. So anyway, this has been an unusual election on any number of counts. I could probably spend the next half hour, 40 minutes just talking about that. But as I say, I want to look at some longer term patterns. I want to look at the growth of minority influence in American politics and then the emergence of a native response, a white response to that empowerment. So just to give you some trends, if we look just at the white vote, the non-Hispanic white vote over the last several elections, President McCain and President Romney would have occupied the White House. But for the first time in American politics, we had sort of a moment when a cohesion in the white community didn't lead to the election of the candidate of the choice of the white community, and on the contrary, a growing minority vote was influential in determining who became president. Obviously, President Obama in the case of 2008 and 2012. And I show you the statistics. I mean, I don't think the specifics are terribly important, but generally you see that the white vote has remained relatively constant in the high 50s for the Republicans, the Republican nominee, and that's been true going back into the 1990s. But you see the minority electorate coalescing around the Democrat. African Americans were always there. Latinos have become more Democratic over this time, and Asian Americans have become way more Democratic over this time, to ensure that minorities in the American electorate are able to overcome a solid vote by the non-Hispanic white population for the Republican nominee. This trend, I am confident, will continue in 2016. Next slide. We don't obviously have turnout data yet for 2016, but we see where the growth is occurring in the American electorate. The non-Hispanic white population grew modestly. Births exceeded death. Births and naturalizations exceeded deaths slightly. But the real growth is coming among Latino adult citizens who could potentially vote, and Asian American adult citizens who also could potentially vote. Now I note that both of those communities do turn out at lower rates than do non-Hispanic whites. So I'll just start calling whites for convenience, and African Americans. But nevertheless, if we just look at this at these demographic trends, we see the future. We can see the future. We've seen the future over the last couple of election cycles, and we continue to see it for 2016. Now, obviously, a lot can happen in a specific election, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This is not simply a national phenomenon. The concentration of minority populations is found in states that have become reliably Democratic over the last 3 or 4 presidential elections, and no state is a better example of that than California, which was a Republican-leaning state in the 1980s, became a battleground state in the 1990s, and now is about as solidly Democratic as any state in the country. Not Hawaii, but close. And we see a lot of today's battleground states are in fact battleground states because of the growth in minority electorate. So I looked at Florida, probably the best example. Rapid growth in the Latino population there, always a solid African American population. North Carolina, that has become a battleground state because African Americans now make up a quarter of voters in North Carolina. That's why Secretary Clinton is doing relatively well there. Nevada, a state that Latinos have moved into battleground status, and certainly one that's very important potentially to Secretary Clinton's victory. Arizona, which at least briefly last week looked like it might be a battleground state. Perhaps not so much right now, but nevertheless, in a wave election, in an election that goes solidly towards the Democrats, Arizona would probably join that. Virginia, and to some degree Ohio. It hasn't seen a great deal of immigration, but African Americans make up a sizable share of the Ohio electorate. So the point here is that certainly we're seeing this national phenomenon, but also in many of the key states, the changes that we're seeing in those states are a function of minority voters, either their growth because of just demographic change or immigration and naturalization. What are the consequences of this? Well, the Democrats have won the popular vote at least, in 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. It's a pretty dramatic statement if you look back over American history. One party rarely does that well for that long. Now, obviously, that was a little bit confounded by the 2000 election, in which Vice President Gore's popular vote victory was not matched in the Electoral College, but nevertheless, broad statement, 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. Democratic nominees in the last 3 cycles have overcome some pretty dramatic glass ceilings. We saw our first African American president, who we would not have seen without solid support from the African American community. And in this election, we see the first woman receiving a nomination from one of the 2 major parties. I'm not so sure this is connected to growth in minority voting, but also worth noting is that we're seeing a lot more religious diversity on the national party tickets. Beginning with the nomination of Senator Lieberman as the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket in 2000, and with the nomination later of Senator Kerry, and then vice presidential nominations of Joe Biden. We've seen religious diversity on the Democratic ticket, and interestingly, the Republicans have followed suit, not just with Governor Romney, but also with Speaker Ryan, then Congressman Ryan, a Roman Catholic, and now with the nomination of Mike Pence. So anyway, things are changing, glass ceilings are being broken. In the off-year elections, obviously, we see something somewhat different. We see a much whiter, much more traditional, if you will, and somewhat more conservative electorate. If I can have the next slide, I'll come back to this one. These are data that just show you the difference in turnout between a presidential year, the most recent presidential year, 2012, and the subsequent off-year election. 2 things that you should take away from this: the electorate is somewhat more non-Hispanic white, somewhat whiter in the off-year election, little bit. But what's interesting is in each racial and ethnic community, you see more conservative turnout. So the selection that goes into who votes in off-year elections promises promises a little bit of racial difference, but a lot of partisan difference. So in addition to the off-year elections where we see or as a result of the off-year elections in which we see a whiter and more conservative electorate, we've seen pretty dramatic shifts over the two off-year cycles in the Obama years to the Republican Party. So if you look at I can do this at the congressional level, it's a little bit less interesting. If you do it at the state legislative level, which gives you a lot more numbers to play around with, when President Obama was elected, state legislatures had a Democratic, averaging them all across the country, about 55% of state legislators were Democrats and 44% were Republicans. By the most recent period, that's pretty much reversed, 56% Republican, 43% Democratic. And certainly over that time, you've seen the House of Representatives switch from Democrats to Republicans, and you've seen the Senate move, at least from very briefly, a filibuster-proof majority for the Democrats to a modest majority for the Republicans. That may switch back this time, at least temporarily. Too forward, please. So we're seeing sort of a response, I think, and it's come to the sort of national attention, the media attention, in the 2016 race, but I think we saw the roots of it somewhat earlier, and that is a disgruntled white electorate, an electorate that is resentful of ongoing changes in the composition of the American electorate and the articulation of the articulation of that resentment. Mr. Trump, who likes media attention, to say the least, has channeled that to some degree, but as I say, we could find good evidence of it before that. It appeared first in the States, and I think the Tea Party movement, the taxed enough already movement that appeared in response to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was probably the best sort of window that we had into this process. The movement started very much as a group of economic conservatives, very reflective of a traditional Republican Party message since President Reagan, of taxed enough already, but almost immediately it shifted to an economic conservative movement that also had a nativist base focusing on immigration and on restriction of immigration. It then provided the engine of efforts to prevent Congress from reforming immigration law late in the Bush years, and then in the Obama years as well. We saw some efforts, particularly in Midwestern states, to challenge the rights, the abilities of unions to organize, and certainly we've seen this very dramatically in terms of efforts to limit voting rights nationally over the period that we're looking at here, the Obama years, but particularly in states in which the Republicans came into power in the 2010 election. If we go to the next slide. This is just to show you where we're seeing efforts to restrict voting access in the 2016 election. These are new efforts for the 2016 election, obviously building on earlier efforts in 2011 and 2013. I'm sure you're familiar with these, but the efforts are to limit the ability of folks to register without proper forms of identification, to limit the frequency with which early voting is allowed, to limit the circumstances under which early voting is allowed, and to require the presentation of specific forms of government-issued identification at polling places. The consequence of these, in sum, would be to restrict access to three groups in American society: young adults, older adults, and racial and ethnic minorities, all of whom are less likely to be able to meet these new standards. I should note that the federal courts here, over the last few months, have been stepping in and have restricted some of the more egregious efforts to restrict voting rights in some of the states. If you go back one. In the 2016 race, this sort of nascent movement that we were seeing at the state level began to move into national politics. Certainly some of the candidates who had led the charge at the state level were some of the early favorites in the competition for the Republican presidential nomination. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, who was one of the early authors both of efforts to restrict the abilities of public sector unions to organize, and also of restricting voting rights in Wisconsin, was one of the early favorites in the Republican presidential nomination, and actually I think sort of surprised people with how poorly he did. He fizzled very early. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, in addition to potentially bringing the Latino electorate or some of the Latino electorate into the Republican camp, had been elected to the Senate originally with support of the Tea Party in Florida, and then Ted Cruz, who is takes pride in periodically shutting down the government over Tea Party issues. All of these, obviously were in the mix. Rubio and Cruz lasted a little bit longer than Walker, but all fizzled. Cruz finally in May of 2016. Obviously, there was one more candidate in the race, a name who's come up a couple times, that's Donald Trump, who seized this anger and was willing to articulate a message, I think, even more dramatic than Governor Walker or Senator Cruz and Rubio. Jenny, go forward. So anyway, I don't, one more, thanks. I don't want to give Trump too much airtime, but some of his message really needs to be repeated to remind ourselves of the sort of new message that he has brought into national politics. Certainly at the local level, some of this kind of rhetoric had been present before, but Trump announces his candidacy. Long speech. All of his speeches tend to be on the longer side, but with a short clip, and that's what got the news coverage. And in it, he accused folks that were immigrating from Mexico of not being, good people in his mind, of being rapists, being drug dealers, and a few he acknowledged might be good people. Later in the race, so that was in July a year ago, and certainly he doubled down on that message throughout the campaign. And one of the chants at his rallies that sort of continued throughout over the last year and a quarter is the demand that the wall that he promised be built. In December, in response to the shootings in San Bernardino, he called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, sort of a religious bar on migration, not present before in American political history. He later backed down, though when Trump backs down, it perhaps isn't as extreme as other people backing down, and called for extreme vetting. Well, all right, given that, but he would allow some Muslims into the United States. In response to a challenge to his own personal economic position in U.S. society, he was being sued for the actions of Trump University, not really a university, but something that presented itself as being an institution of higher learning, and was concerned that the federal district judge randomly assigned to the case was of Mexican ancestry. Not Mexican born, not that it would make a difference, but of Mexican ancestry, born in Indiana, as everybody likes to point out. And Judge Curiel, Trump said of him, he's a Mexican. We're building a wall here and between here and Mexico. The answer is he's giving us very unfair rulings that people can't even believe. So, that Curiel was somehow suspicious simply because of his ethnic ancestry. It was at this point that Speaker Ryan, for the first time, withdrew his support for Mr. Trump. Finally, sort of one of his refrains in the general election since the party conventions has been a sort of expectation that he can somehow assert that the African American vote would be his. And his way of sort of identifying his sympathy for the African American community is speaking of the inner city. Now, obviously, this is sort of a dated reference. Inner cities now are sites of gentrification and places that people want to live. But in his mind, this is where African Americans live, and encapsulates their experience and, by extension, the failure of the Democratic Party. His message, obviously, is not entirely negative. I show you the picture here. Probably you can't see in the back, and I apologize for that, of his effort on Cinco de Mayo to reach out to the people of Mexican ancestry in the United States, eating a taco bowl. And I'm sure many of you have had the chance to visit Mexico over the years, and you realize that that's really not something that is eaten in Mexico. Certainly not provided by the commissary there at the Trump Tower. But nevertheless, that was his effort to reach out, and I'm sure people appreciated it. So, Trump's rhetoric is one thing, but I want to say that the story here is not simply using sort of provocative kind of language as a way of winning support. He was able to identify an issue that allowed him to single himself out in this crowded field of Republican candidates. It was, at its high point, it was 17 by the time the primaries began. I think it was down to 14. And that was the issue of immigration, which, as I say, he hit on the first day of his campaign and returned to regularly throughout the race. I'm going to show you now some exit poll data. I apologize. Please don't worry about the specifics. I'll try to summarize what I think is important here, but I just want to make the point that the same pattern appeared repeatedly, and this pattern allowed Trump to stand out above the other 16 or the other 13, depending on when you're doing the count. So in the first presidential primary, this is in Iowa, the major candidates tended to split their votes on most issues except for one, and that one was immigration. And it was there that Trump was able to distinguish himself and, get sort of more than if you divide the leading candidates by 4 and, get 25%. Now, you may remember he actually lost in the Iowa caucuses, but he was very close, and certainly for an outsider, that was enough to claim that he was, very much still in the race. We go on a week later to the state of New Hampshire. And here again, one issue distinguishes Trump from the other 3 front runners. That's the issue of immigration, and he gets a disproportionate share of the vote of voters in New Hampshire that think that immigration is the most important issue facing the nation in the 2016 race. Now, note that there are a smaller percentage of New Hampshire Republicans than some of the other issues, but nevertheless, this is the one where he got himself, where he was able to seize an advantage. We move on about a week later, I know I'm taking you down memory lane here, to South Carolina, and we see the exact same pattern. Well, by the end of these 3 primaries and caucuses, if you remember, Trump was not in a field of 14 anymore, he was in a field of 3 or 4 with a couple just barely hanging on, most notably Jeb Bush. So this one issue that Trump was willing to go further on than any of his Republican peers, and this was a very right-leaning Republican audience, Trump was able to seize that, and that allowed him to move his candidacy from one of a field to the leading candidate. I now jump you ahead, without taking you through each of the individual steps, to the final primary in the Republican election. This was the night that Ted Cruz and John Kasich dropped out of the race. And again, you see the one issue where Trump is able to really seize the Republican electorate here in Indiana, and that's immigration. So this, whether it was conscious on Trump's part or sort of throwing out a laundry list of issues for his campaign to run on, he was able to seize that anger in the Republican electorate, and I'll note, an anger that is particularly found in these early primary and caucus states that shape who becomes the Republican nominee, to distinguish himself and then to move into the lead. Now, I don't want to denigrate all Republicans. I realize the Concerned Citizens are a nonpartisan organization. So here I'll credit the Republican National Committee, who after the 2012 loss, which they really didn't expect. I don't know if you remember that night, but Governor Romney went into the day thinking that he was going to win the election. His internal polling showed that. This was probably most dramatically brought home when Karl Rove was commentating on Fox News, and the Fox News statisticians called Ohio for Obama, which gave the race to Obama, and Rove sort of stormed down the hall with the camera following him to go talk to the statisticians. And I've learned one thing in my career: that's never challenge a statistician who thinks he's right. They're really pretty confident. They won't make a call unless they're confident about it. Well, anyway, the Republicans were disappointed, surprised, shocked by their defeat in 2012. So they commissioned an analysis of what had happened to the party in 2012. This was nominally called the Growth and Opportunity Project, but almost immediately it came to be called the Autopsy, and Republicans used that as well. And it wasn't used in a judgmental sort of sense. They realized what they were doing. They're trying to figure out why they had lost. That's what a party should do. And this report did a number of things, but I think it made 2 very important points. One was that minority communities can be brought into the Republican tent. And certainly they could look back to the 2004 race when President Bush, running for re-election, did relatively well. Earned 40% of the Latino vote, if I remember correctly, earned 35 or 40% of the Asian American vote, and did slightly better than he and his father had done among African Americans. So minorities will listen to the Republican message of small government and lower taxes and entrepreneurial opportunity, but they will not listen to that message if what they hear before that is denigration of their status in the United States, their right of being here, their sense of welcome in the United States. So the Republicans at least organized themselves for 2016 around the notion that they had to send a more positive message to minority communities. And they also extended this not just to racial and ethnic minorities, but also to other groups in society that the Republicans traditionally excluded. This autopsy, I think, explains why Republican leaders, including, I would point out, Senator Rubio, sought to reform immigration in 2013, and this was done in a bipartisan manner. The bill that passed the United States Senate in that year not only had every Democratic vote in the Senate, but also 14 Republican senators joining. So the Republicans know what's going on. The challenge that they face, of course, is that their base doesn't get it. And, you know, the face. So these are data not from the current Congress, from the previous Congress, showing the composition of districts represented in the House of Representatives by Democrats and districts represented in the House of Representatives by Republicans. And what you see is the districts represented by Republicans are much less likely to have minority voters, and on average, only a quarter of those districts include blacks. Only a quarter of those districts is composed of blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans. Where if you look at the average district represented by Democrats in the House of Representatives, roughly half of the constituents are minorities. So what does that mean? Well, it means that a Republican member of Congress really doesn't have to worry about minority voters. What he or she does have to worry about, on the other hand, is someone to the right of that member seeking to challenge that office holder in the party primary the next year. And Republicans look very clearly to the defeat in 2014 of the second-ranking Republican member of the House of Representatives, Eric Cantor of Virginia, who had raised money for every Republican in Congress, served his party very, very well, and was challenged in what was considered to be a sort of foolhardy way by a single-issue candidate in this rural Virginia district. And the single-issue candidate claimed that Representative Cantor was soft on immigration because he had, at one point in the past, indicated support for the DREAM Act. This unknown, unheard of, and even worse, academic, guys and economists, candidate beat Cantor in a party primary, and that scared every Republican in the House of Representatives, and probably at the state level, though I don't really have data on that. To the degree that this is representative of the composition of congressional districts moving forward, and certainly will be until, at a minimum, the redistricting that follows the 2020 census, Republicans are going to be looking to their right, not to their middle. And that means that the autopsy will probably not be very well heard. So let me conclude then by thinking about this Obama coalition, the sort of minority coalition, the coalition of minority communities that have become much more democratic over the last 8 years. And it's a coalition, obviously, with white liberals. And think about how this white anger that has been energized in the 2016 election will balance with the changing demographics of the United States. Well, I want to offer a caution. I mean, it's like all of you, I'm sort of desperately looking forward to next week, get this all behind us so that I can start focusing on some other things. But I don't think 2016 is going to be a very good test for a couple of reasons. One, Trump has a populist appeal that I think transcends some, sort of the traditional candidate that we're likely to get in 2020 or 2024. Equally importantly, though, he's running a very poor campaign in that he has a very poor ground game. We're getting data daily on early voting in all of the states, and in almost all of the states, the early voting is looking very good for the Democrats. Well, that isn't necessarily, it's definitely a compliment to Secretary Clinton's campaign, but not necessarily Secretary Clinton. What it means is they're doing something and Trump isn't, and he is, in his sort of fit of pique with the Republican Party, has failed to channel what they have, which is a resource for him. If you go temporarily to the next slide, this is where investments are being made by the two candidates in get out the vote kinds of voter registration and then get out the vote kind of efforts. And what you see is, and I have to remind myself of the colors, any circle in which the blue is bigger than the red, that means that Clinton is doing more there. And any place where the red is bigger than the blue, that means that Trump is doing more. What you see is that in almost all of the battleground states, Clinton is doing a lot more than Trump. And this speaks to just the sort of poor management of the Trump campaign, or the failure of the Trump campaign to work successfully with the Republican Party. Go back. 2016, I think, is also not a very good test in that Trump's rhetoric has mobilized two parts of the electorate that could reasonably be expected to vote with the Republicans in the future. Certainly, the gender gap that we're seeing in pre-election polling is wider than it ever has been before, with women much more likely, even Republican women, much more likely to support the Clinton candidacy for a number of reasons, I think, that we can all remember. We're also seeing that educated whites, which is an electorate that has traditionally voted Republican, may actually split its votes this time, and that would be a significant. So anyway, I don't want to read too much into 2016, but I think looking forward, we can fully expect that there will be elements of the Republican Party. This is assuming that Mr. Trump loses, which I'm not assuming by any means in today's polling, but the elements of the Republican Party will seize the Trump example, and I think we're already seeing that to some degree with some state-level candidates. It is likely that the people that seize this Trump example will have better political skills than Mr. Trump does. And here I think particularly of Texas Senator Cruz, who can channel that same sort of anger, but at the same time understands the role of party and the role of traditional sort of investment and get out the vote. In the short term, consequently, I think the inclusiveness that was articulated in the autopsy will be much less likely to be successful at the national level or at the state level. In the longer run, though, these demographic pressures are going to continue. The steady rise in the share of the minority electorate out of the total electorate, and then its support for the Democratic Party is likely to only grow in response to this message of unwelcome. In the short term, certainly there is some fear that the challenge, the threat of increased enforcement of voting laws or something like that will turn people away. We have plenty of historical examples going back to the 1800 election, if we want to, that when you tell people that they can't participate, what they do is they come back and participate even more. And certainly with immigrant ethnic communities, and certainly Latinos and Asian Americans fit into that, we've seen that pattern very dramatically in the 1920s in response to Prohibition, and then here in California in the 1990s in response to Proposition 187. So history suggests, I think, that this effort to exclude minority voters will be a short-term barrier, and in the longer term, these trends that were quite evident in 2008 and 2012 will reemerge. Any single election is always risky when you are trying to make predictions, but the long-term trend is that minority electorates will grow in size and salience in the American electoral process. On that note, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Have your questions ready and raise your hand, or brief comments, and Diane Rees will come around. Thank you again. Wonderful information.
My natural instinct is to rove at this point, but I don't want to do that to the videographer.
Okay. We read a lot about the angry white man, but I never really get a description of that person. When I see that the average person that fits that group makes $62,000 to $72,000 a year, that's a lot of money in many of the states of the United States, excluding areas of California. We've seen a lot of manufacturing going away, but that's been going on for many decades, and automation has replaced a lot of those jobs. So it can't be that a lot of these people are just complaining that they don't have manufacturing jobs anymore. So I don't really understand what the issue is. Is it about politics or religion or?
I think it's about both politics and religion and expectations for the future. One of the better predictors of sort of vote choice and partisanship has to do with sort of questions about looking forward. You know, it can be asked about you, it can be asked about your children, and there's certainly a sense among many in American society that U.S. society is changing. They see immigrant ethnic groups that they've never seen before moving into their schools, into their communities. They see change going on that they probably never had any control over, but now they have a group to blame, immigrants. And I think that's why Mr. Trump was so able to use immigration, particularly Mexican immigration, as a key point in his campaign. So it is certainly manufacturing or industrial jobs is part of the story. Those, as you say, have been going for a long time, but it's the sense that a good share of the American electorate doesn't think that their children will have the same opportunities they did, and that's probably true. But I would say that the better response, and this is what I think Secretary Clinton tried to say, though issues didn't play well in this campaign, was that by building the economy, in other words, by bringing immigrants in, by bringing formerly excluded populations in, we'll be able to build a better economy, and then everybody's kids will be in better shape. But that message never really got through. It was much easier to pick on, they're streaming in and they're bringing drugs.
My question, actually, a comment that I'd like you to comment on is kind of to the same issue. We hear about, people talk about the Trump voters, the angry white men. And
women too.
Yeah, women too, exactly. And when people discuss that, they discuss how these people's issues have not been addressed, that the parties have abandoned them completely. But I look at it a little differently. And I look at the people that we're talking about, or some of the people we're talking about, as people who live in the Midwest, who were the sons and the daughters of the people who were lifelong Democrats who decided to vote for Ronald Reagan. You know, they'd rather have a beer, or think they'd rather have a beer with the president than a union to represent him. And I just wonder if, to me, they deserted the Democratic Party. It wasn't the political parties that deserted them, so I wonder what you thought of that.
Well, the Trump vote, which will probably be 41 or 42% of the national electorate, is not just made up of angry white men and women. So some of that is pure partisanship, and that's what parties are supposed to do. You know, if we know nothing else, the D or the R after someone's name means something. So Trump would not be at the levels he has been in the polls simply because of sort of the anger of those lacking college education who maybe have lost jobs. No, I think you're absolutely right that some subset of certainly his primary electorate and now certainly the electorate that makes a state like Ohio competitive for him, he's been ahead in the polls more than he's been behind there, are the old Reagan Democrats, are folks that have been unsure of the sort of growing diversity of the Democratic Party going way back, not just going back to President Obama. What has changed, I think, recognizing that the Reagan Democrats have been a highly coveted electorate for a long time. There's that county in Michigan that everybody used to pay attention to. We don't anymore because Michigan, I think, is moved more solidly into the Democratic Party. Is that there's the sort of selectivity in information that they can now get. And there's been sort of an effort for all parts of the electorate, but certainly for the angry right part of the electorate, to get one subset of news. And that news has reinforced a message of President Obama being incompetent, President Obama perhaps not being qualified to serve as president because of the location of his birth. Where in the Reagan era there was genuine competition for those voters, and the Democrats were trying to reach in, trying to hold on to them to some degree, I'd say the Democrats have largely given up and have let those sort of Midwestern, older voters move away from the party. And they don't have a particular strategy to reach back in anymore because they don't have a information source that gets to them in the way that they would have 30 years ago. That said, President Obama was able to win election and then re-election without those votes. So, it's in some ways the negligence of the Democratic Party for leaving them out there for a demagogue to seize. Yes.
How much of the message that's not stated all the time about gender inequality is threatening white men because their status is starting to disappear with women and minorities. It is more convenient to talk about than the underclass in terms of women, in terms of being treated, in the workplace and politically. How?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think women have been much more sensitive to Mr. Trump's message, and not solely because of the groping video a couple of weeks ago. I mean, he was not doing as well with them as Romney had 4 years ago and McCain had 8 years ago, well before that. So the sort of economic message of the Trump campaign, oh, my daughter's doing fine, but, other women should just quit if they're in a harassing work environment, is not one that's played very well among women. And this is purely anecdotal. There's an article in yesterday's New York Times about an increasing evidence of households that are basically splitting each other's votes. Men, the husband and wife going to the polling place, knowing that the other one is voting against them, but sort of enjoying or living that experience. With the polls tightening again, I think should Secretary Clinton win, it will be because she is doing well with educated whites, certainly, but also because she's doing particularly well with women across the economic spectrum.
One area that Trump continuously gets credit for, especially in the debates, is when he talks concretely about the 15% tax decrease that he's going to offer corporations if they come back to the United States, and the penalties that he's going to impose on those companies who continue to export jobs. So, I mean, there are a lot of jobs that we have lost in addition to manufacturing, a lot of white-collar jobs, computer jobs, technology, etc., because they can be done all over the world. What do you think about that economic plan that he has?
Well, look, I'm not an economist, so I should be careful here. I've listened to both candidates talk, and it seems this is an area where there is some agreement between them on the need to reduce the corporate share of federal taxation. On the personal share, they have very different approaches, and Secretary Clinton has sort of channeled Democrats going way back, saying that she will raise personal income taxes. Mr. Trump has said that he will reduce them. The U.S., if you compare across the advanced democracies, does have higher corporate taxes than do a lot of our competitors. So that presents a problem from an economic perspective. I'd remind everybody that President Obama and Speaker Boehner tried to work out the so-called grand bargain in a brief moment when it looked like Republicans might go along with anything that President Obama proposed. Speaker Boehner certainly invested time in that, suggesting that he saw some value in it, and it was within Republican orthodoxy, and that would have, among other things, reduced corporate taxes in the U.S. and then created a funnel to bring some of that money back that is now abroad tax-free. That grand bargain obviously didn't go anywhere, and my reading is that it didn't go anywhere because Republican members of the House said that they wouldn't support anything with Obama's name.
Hi. I wonder if you could speak to the potential, I'm over here. Over here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm Sue. You give a great talk. We enjoyed it. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the potential for heterogeneity within minorities. You're talking a lot about minorities, but actually they're very different. And I particularly wonder if you might speak to the potential for diversity within the Mexican population, because we do know that newer Mexican immigrants are an economic threat to older Mexican immigrants. We also know, well, that's what economists tell us. Also, we are aware that there has been a trend, sort of historically, where groups that have longer residence might turn against even their fellow co-ethnics who are more junior. So I'd be interested in your reactions to those issues.
Absolutely, and I'm sorry if I've over-homogenized minority populations. What is interesting to me in those data that I showed very early on is that there has been, at least in partisan terms, a coalescence in minority communities, meaning that African Americans have always been pretty solidly Democrat. Latinos and Asian Americans have moved in that direction over the last several elections. So at least in that one metric, we do have some evidence of larger shares of minority communities having the same attitude than the comparable attitude in white communities. But the question is absolutely right. It would be silly to sort of assume that somebody who traces his or her ancestry to New Mexico in the 1600s would necessarily have a lot culturally in common with somebody who migrated yesterday from Mexico, whether in legal status or in unauthorized status. One consequence, however, of the rhetoric that Mr. Trump has used, and certainly rhetoric that we saw coming out of the Republican Party in the 2008 race and the 2012 race, was to remind some of those longer-term residents of the difficulties that their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever it was, faced. So you have seen immigration and the rights of, more importantly, the rights of immigrants becoming more central to Latino identity, and then in Asian American, more central to Asian American identities. But certainly over time and at the local level, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Asian American communities will not have common interests. Probably the most dramatic example is when, hypothetically, you have a Chinese candidate running for office against a Vietnamese candidate. Their national origin sort of identities will come through. In economic terms, you're certainly right that a second or a third generation person of Mexican ancestry or other Latino ancestries might have the same fears of competition or of cultural change that a person of non-Latino ancestry might have if a new population comes in, say Guatemalans or Salvadorans. So certainly over time we'll see greater heterogeneity in these populations in terms of their political attitudes and their interests. But I think this sort of stridently anti-immigrant, nativist kind of rhetoric has brought Latinos and Asian Americans closer together, and then African Americans are always there. I think one other caution that we need to make is that sometimes there's this sort of conversation about the unauthorized population and then legal immigrants and permanent residents, assuming that they're really two separate populations. In reality, there are a lot of mixed status families. One child was born here, so he or she's a U.S. citizen. Another aunt in the household was able to immigrate legally some time ago under some provision of the law, and then somebody else came in unauthorized status. So the issue of status and the need for some sort of comprehensive immigration reform that moves immigrants towards legal status is one that reaches well beyond simply the unauthorized immigrant community. That I think that is something the Republicans haven't quite realized. Not just Mr. Trump here, but Governor Romney. Actually, Senator McCain did understand that, and had the country been a little bit different, probably would have been able to achieve a lot in terms of immigration reform.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I feel very strongly that media and most of us look at a kind of a superficial view of the election. And it seems to me that Trump would not have been successful had we not had a situation in this country where the rich are much richer and the poor are much poorer. We have the largest gap since the depressions in the 20s and 30s. And it seems to me we ought to examine, as Bernie Sanders did, something more fundamental, and that is the impact of capitalism and how that has actually led to such people as Trump becoming popular.
Well, it's funny, Mr. Trump, for his various weaknesses, is better able to articulate a message of sort of class resentment than going back I'm thinking back in my own mind, I can't really come up with anybody comparable. And if that's what it takes to highlight the failings of the system, maybe that's not such a bad consequence of his candidacy in the end. Senator Sanders, I think were Senator Sanders the nominee right now, I'd probably be making the same criticisms of him that I am of Mr. Trump, in that his candidacy would have been an artifact of the odd electorates in those early primary and caucus states. So the sort of message of sort of opportunity is an important one, but I don't know that a candidate at the either extreme will ultimately be a very successful candidate in our system, where in the general election we generally pick one of the two major parties, candidates of one of the two major parties, and we've seen, as we might expect, Governor Johnson and Ms. Stein's numbers going down, I think that's a rational response to their likely opportunities of winning. Governor Johnson does have a unique opportunity. If he gets more than 5% of the vote, it means the Libertarians will have funding in the 2020 elections and for their primaries, and would also have the opportunity in this phase of the 2020 cycle to have a sort of transition team in place in Washington, sort of preparing for what would happen if the Libertarians were to win the presidency in 2020. So that 5% threshold is not trivial.
Thank you very much for approaching what you did, but I think we left a little bit of history out of here. Back in 2008, instantly when Mr. Obama became President Obama, Mitch McConnell says, one-term president. Came the surprise of the second 2012 election, it became a party of no. Now the no wasn't so much that it was no, it was that we will bottle up any legislation that comes to committee, will not get to the floor, and bottle it up to the point where we will not even allow it in committee. Now, don't you think that there's as much danger right now, and we should be talking a lot more about the senatorial and House elections? I don't understand this emphasis, and I feel that the Democratic Party has not done a job of selling why Mr. Obama isn't more popular. What he was trying to do, he got bottled up under ACA, and they kept him there. That is deliberate and intentional, and it is not a matter of looking at anything else the Democrats want to do or could do. It is a matter of a disruptive, disorganized Republican Party showing only one point of unity, and that is we will not allow a Democrat, especially a black Democratic president, succeed. Can you address why we had this and why Mr. Boehner left his position? Because this is part of that same issue. And we're talking about a presidency. Well, presidents cannot be successful without a supportive Congress.
Well, I think you identify sort of one of the key differences between this election potentially in 1948. In 1948, Harry Truman was able to run against a do-nothing Congress. Today, if President Obama tried that, he'd get his message out to MSNBC. They all believe it already. Fox News would denigrate him as they always do and wouldn't sort of pick up the substance of the message. And CNN would probably cover it, and NPR would cover it. But where in the past we've had a cohesive national media that could get sort of counter narratives out there. We had 3 major television networks, and you had to watch one of them whether you wanted to or not, and the newspapers, of course. We don't have a way that a party can run against the other party and get its message out to the other party's partisans. And that's not to say that everybody in America is in one of those silos. Obviously, there are people that search out non-biased or non-partisan news, at least. But efforts by President Obama, whether it was in 2012 or then in the off-year elections, to sort of run against the Republicans as opposed to run affirmatively as the president of change, failed. One thing I would disagree with you on, though, is the idea that the Republicans are disorganized. I think quite the contrary. They're highly, highly organized. They don't always speak with one voice, but the Freedom Caucus, the sort of group of 40 or 50, numbers vary, members of the House of Representatives who are the most rigorous in this party of no message, are hugely organized. They will block anything from coming to the floor that they oppose, and the 2 speakers, Boehner and Ryan, have honored that by only occasionally violating the so-called Tasker rule, that you need a majority in your own caucus to bring something to the floor. Ryan, in principle, had a better position going in. You're absolutely right. The Freedom Caucus forced Boehner out. But I suspect he's lost that now with his sort of waffling on the whole Trump candidacy. Whether he survives or not will really depend. If the House ends up being close, I think he'll survive because he's a leader and he can pull people together. If it's, as it is now, about a 30-seat majority, he may be out. In terms of the Senate, yeah, I apologize for not talking about that. Part of my daily compulsion of looking at all the polls certainly has me looking at the Senate seats as well. I would point out that a couple of the ones that are still up in the air are in these states that I think are important for a newly emergent minority electorate. North Carolina, I would point to here as a particular example. New Mexico a couple of weeks ago, when it looked like McCain might be at risk. Certainly if McCain is defeated, that will be based on Latino votes. Interestingly, Latinos mad at Joe Arpaio, not particularly Latinos mad at John McCain. And then Nevada, probably the best example, a state that has stayed in the Democratic camp with Senator Reid and now in an open seat race because Latino votes turn out there and they're highly unionized and can be reached by Democratic Party organizations. So yeah, to the degree that the Senate tips, and I guess my prediction would still be that it'll be 51 or 52 for the Democrats, that will be built in part on sort of a newly energized minority electorate. And then, the Senate always has sort of the unexpected one, and that's Missouri. And that just seems like a really interesting race where you have somebody who's closer to the, a Democrat who's closer to the voters, who seems to have resonated with them, and a slightly out of touch incumbent who happens to be a Republican.
One of the things about this Trump candidacy that's disturbing me is the undertone of threat, the enthusiasm with which he's been welcomed by the alt-right and the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan. How much of a threat do you perceive in that?
Well, I hear threat in most everything, I guess. Certainly the idea that one might not concede the election if one has been solidly defeated is fundamentally appalling. And that this is where his not being sort of a traditional politician is a danger, because he hears the people at his rallies who are people who believe, sort of what you've articulated and some other things, and he thinks they are representative of the broader electorate. Somebody like Richard Nixon, you can criticize him, I guess this is his old congressional district, so we can do it freely. He talked about the silent majority, but he knew that he never represented, that the silent majority actually had different views. So, so I think Trump's, I worry about sort of Trump's believing his own rhetoric, and then the people around him, and obviously folks from the alt-right are part of that, channeling that. I guess he will have to make a decision, assuming he loses in the Electoral College, on how quickly he responds and whether he wants to do it graciously or not. But he's continually surprised me throughout this race, so what he does in a week will probably surprise me as well.
To step back for a moment, the political parties used to each have a spectrum of political opinion, and that's no longer the case since Karl Rove decided to move the Republican Party to its base. So we have gridlock. What do you see as the long-term situation here? It seems like part of the tension in this election is the frustration that Congress can't do anything. And are we just going to be locked into a system of a liberal party and a conservative party and nothing ever being able to be accomplished?
Well, we are in a moment, in historical terms, a pretty unique division between the two parties in historical terms. And that was brought home, I think, in the 2000 race when the presidential race was about 800,000, split by about 800,000, which is not that much in a 120 million electorate. And obviously the Electoral College went a different way than the popular vote. It was reinforced, certainly coming out of the 2010 election. The Republicans did very well in that off-year election, and consequently were able to redistrict the House in a way that, sort of good political scientists estimate gave them about a 12-seat advantage that they wouldn't have had otherwise. That will likely change after 2020, in that 2020 will be a presidential year, which will bring out, a different electorate than 2010. The state legislatures will be less likely to be as solidly Republican, and maybe even tilt back to the Democrats, which would at a minimum, get back those 12 seats and then maybe add a few redistricting going the other way, or gerrymandering going the other way. But I think the longer term trend is sort of what I began the lecture with. We're seeing a change in the electorate, and that's what's frightening some people in the electorate. And at some point, and I don't like to make predictions because it's a different prediction for each state, we will see, formally solidly Republican states become competitive. So Arizona comes to mind in the current cycle, and then formally competitive states become pretty solidly Democratic. Colorado comes to mind in the current cycle. That obviously doesn't, that certainly doesn't address all 50 states, but you only need enough of those so that electoral college victories become more the norm for one party, the Democrats, which we've seen since '92, and then state legislatures tipping in some of those states. So I guess my sort of demographic prediction is that unless the Republicans can find a new way to speak to minority communities, they will steadily lose more and more of these sort of state level things, but the state level things add up to national level things.
Right here.
Yes.
Hi. My question is about the use of social media. Are you studying now the effects among the minority communities? I mean, I see what's going on in my community on the social media, but I would wonder how that differs from what's going on in the minority.
Well, certainly,
social media.
there has traditionally been a little bit of a problem with the so-called digital divide, the somewhat lower levels of access to the internet and consequently to social media in minority communities than in majority communities, and it's a function of economics and such. That said, just looking at what Secretary Clinton has done, and she's been the more sort of she has been more consciously reaching out to minority communities in this electorate. She has had a whole social media outreach campaign that has included, video content, but also, sort of other kinds of messaging. So, that is part of the story for any part of the U.S. population. As I say, minority communities are probably a little bit behind the curve because of access issues.
Right here.
There was a follow-up, I think.
There's a follow-up. Access nowadays, almost everyone has cell phones.
And they get it on the cell phones. They get access to the social media. And I mean, even teenagers are using that social media.
Well, there's access, but there's access and there's free access. So to the degree that folks have cell phones, they may, in some cases, have more limited data plans and not be places where they can get, wireless. So the evidence is that there is still, in minority communities, relatively modestly less access on an ongoing basis than in majority white communities. Yeah.
Okay, we've talked about minority communities, et cetera, and we've talked about, the white, uneducated male, middle-aged, et cetera. But there's something that I probably shouldn't mention in this group because you should know your audience. However, with the older population getting older and then ultimately, should we not be encouraging the younger generation to get out and vote and focus on them a little bit more?
Yeah, our 69-year-old and 70-year-old candidates may not be the best messengers to that community. In 2012, young people, which is defined in electoral terms as under 30, and it's a silly category, actually voted at higher rates than the over 65. So the right candidate can reach into those communities. The evidence would be, at least for Secretary Clinton, that she has not been very successful at reaching into that population in this cycle. I am relatively, well, should she win election, then there would obviously be talk about a re-election. I'm relatively confident that we will never have another presidential race in the United States with, candidates whose total age is 140.
Please God.
For the reasons that you identify, the electorate has changed. Let me tell the other side of that story. My mother, who's 97, voted yesterday. She was obviously born before she could vote. I mean, she was born before she could vote. This is in Chicago. She was born before Lincoln could vote. And she had the opportunity, when we did her ballot yesterday, to vote for a woman candidate. So, age works in a lot of interesting ways. I won't say how she voted. That's her, she has that right of privacy. She did note the uniqueness of the opportunity in her perspective. Yes.
You alluded in one of your slides to the effect of the fact that Republican districts tend to be largely white and like 75% white, whereas Democratic districts tend to be much more homogeneous. Heterogeneous, sorry. I want to ask you the question is this an effect of gerrymandering of districts, and how do the Democrats go about making sure that they get their fair share of districts that are more heterogeneous than?
It is in part a consequence of gerrymandering, but not entirely. Even if you did a complete, if you picked a random point in each state and districted out from there, you're still going to have some districts that are overwhelmingly one party or the other, just because we clustered around each other. I don't want to overstate the effect of gerrymandering, but certainly the Republicans were very tactical after the 2010 race, as Democrats have been in the past. This is a bipartisan criticism, to concentrate Democrats into Democratic districts, meaning making sure that each Democratic district was 70 or 80% Democratic. We're only making sure that Republican districts were 60% Democratic, meaning you have more Republicans to throw around. President Obama, for what it's worth, has said that one of the two things that he plans to do, after he leaves office, one is to focus on the needs of particularly young African American men, but the second is to focus on organizing around redistricting, preparing for redistricting in 2020. I'm absolutely confident that the Democrats learned from the Republicans, because the Republicans in 2010 did an excellent job. The power to execute that will be a result of who is elected in the 2020 election. Or the decision of some states, and here at California, on the more positive side, of looking for alternatives to legislatures doing the redistricting process. There are a couple of models out there. I don't anticipate that they'll get implemented in other states before 2020, but there will be citizen pressures for that looking forward.
Okay. We have a number of well-known Republicans, including President George Bush, who have said that they would never vote for Trump. As a matter of fact, they say they will vote for Hillary Clinton. We see this throughout the country, actually. A number of Republicans who will not vote for Trump. Is this the beginning of a split? Because it is being predicted by a number of columnists that this is the end of the Republican Party, that there's going to be something different in the future because of Trump's nomination and support by leading Republicans.
I think there will be something different in the future. I think it will continue to be named Republican. If for no other reason than there's a huge investment in 50 states and 3,000 different electoral jurisdictions nationwide in this silo called Republican. So it's very hard to sort of overcome that. Yes, but there will certainly be a fight for the soul of the Republican Party, determined first by who wins next Tuesday. But then, what had traditionally been sort of a social conservative wing and an economic conservative wing, now have a third part, which is a populist, nativist sort of wing of the party. I don't envy Reince Priebus or Speaker Ryan, because they have to sort of marshal these efforts, and I don't think it will be, well, it won't be resolved for a number of years, but it certainly, we won't even have an initial answer until we see who wins the 2020 presidential nomination. Do they go, as they have traditionally, with an establishment figure who can at least nominally unite the different wings of the party, or do they go with another outsider, bomb thrower, Ted Cruz?
Professor, thank you very much for your talk. I've been a campaign volunteer since Jesus was a boy. And one thing that has been a constant challenge to us has been getting Latinos registered and to the polls. I'm wondering what your estimation of how robust the electorate, the Latino electorate, will be in this election.
I would imagine it will be comparable to the last few, which is about 50% of the citizen adult population turning out, as opposed to 66, 67% in the white and black communities. Why is that? Well, in part because Latinos live in the wrong places. And that's a terrible thing to say, but if half of the Latino population lives in California and Texas, well, we haven't really had any very stimulating statewide races here for a while. Maybe you go back to the recall race, I'm not quite sure. Texas has been pretty much the same, maybe even a little bit worse. So, what turns people out in part is having some investment in the outcome. And I think the message that a lot of irregular voters get is, well, in Texas and California, your vote doesn't count too much. And to be honest, at least in the presidential race, that's really true. I think a second reason Latinos turn out at lower rates is they're much younger. The average Latino adult is 27. The average white adult is 38 or 39. Younger adults turn out less than older adults, whatever, and then the Latino community just has more people in that age cohort. Latinos are also a little poorer. That again is a disadvantage. What I think is probably more important is to look at whether there are successful efforts to get higher turnout rates in states where Latinos can make a difference in big ticket races, whether Senate races or the presidential race. So Nevada is sort of the place that we'll all be looking as soon as we can start to get some good data in a couple of weeks. To a lesser degree, Florida, you have a truly heterogeneous, getting to the earlier question, Latino population there with a large Puerto Rican share, a large Cuban American share, and then sort of other parts of Latin America. Cuban Americans are moving towards the Democrats, so I think that probably bodes well for Secretary Clinton. But that's another state where Secretary Clinton is clearly making an investment in both voter registration in the Latino community and get out the vote efforts in Latino communities. So that's where I would look rather than looking at a national average or a national turnout rate of 50%, which sounds terrible and is, but may not reflect how people respond to being asked, which is the real important story.